For those of you joining us, welcome, welcome. We're going to hang out for a minute and let some other folks join, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm going to mute so you don't have to hear crazy noises behind me. But again, welcome, and we'll be with you here shortly. Okay, Charlene and Luke, how do you feel about getting going? It looks like we have, can't see you all out there, but I believe we have something like 45 people in the audience. So we ready to rock and roll? Yep. And everyone can hear me? Thumbs up. Sweet. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Lindsay Feitz. I'm the director of the Gender and Women's Studies program, and I'm delighted to be introducing and welcoming Charlene Walt to our campus. GWST is lucky enough to be part of DU's global master's program, and we have partnerships around the world, including in South Africa. And so at this point, a bit about our program, we like to sort of invite scholars, faculty to sort of share their research. Charlene is going to do, I think, an amazing talk here with us in a few minutes. But I would just encourage, if there's anyone out there, I know I have a bunch of students from class. So hi, everybody. Happy snow day. But if anybody out there wants to know more about the Global Master's Program, or just GWST in general, please do feel free to reach out to me directly. And for more information about how this talk and Charlene's visit came into being, I'm going to turn it over to Luke Bodwin, who is a professor in Gender and Women's Studies, a lovely human being, and also in many ways the architect of the cool Global Master's Program that we have here at DU. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Luke.
Thanks, Lindsay. Welcome to this talk, which you see the title, We Are Family Until We Are Not, reflecting on Joseph in the context of Izitabane and vulnerability, violence, identity, erasure, and the imperative of recognition and accompaniment. The talk is by Charlene Walt. And Charlene is the head of the Gender and Religion program at the School of Religion, Philosophy, and Classics at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa, and also serves as the Deputy Director of the Ujamaa Center for Biblical and Theological Community Development and Research. Charlene's primary research interests include queer theory, theology, queer theory and queer theology, queer biblical hermeneutics, contextual Bible study, and emerging experimental pedagogies in the study of religion and theology. I count Charlene as a friend, and I have known her now for a number of years. And just as context, we are looking at developing a program with UKZN, with the school that Charlene runs, that would help our undergraduate students to be able to go and spend a year in South Africa and then complete a master's program. And that's the global master's that we do currently with Lund University, for example, same concept. But this time, it would be an entirely different experience. And it's a very exciting thing to be considering. Charlene has been here since through the month of December and January, and we've been talking about this. This talk is part of the context of just getting to know each other so that students in the DU community can also know what Charlene does. I remember going to Pietermaritzburg to the School of Gender and Religion with Jeremy Hafner, now our chancellor, then our provost, and meeting the students that Charlene is teaching in the master's program and listening to some fantastic presentations. So this is really exciting. And now I'm handing it over to Charlene. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues, and thank you for just the incredible, gracious hosting at DU. I have myself and my partner have had a fantastic time navigating snow. This is my first snow day in my entire life. And it's been really great. So Luke, Kate, and Lindsay, thank you so much just for everything that you've done for us and how you've made us feel so welcome. And then a special word of welcome to Luke's queer theory class. You've been the highlight of my stay in Denver, and it's just so great to see some of you here. And thank you, thank you just for the opportunity to engage and to journey with each other. I'm going to share with you this talk. It's like everything, it feels a little bit premature to talk about it because it's work that is in the process of developing. It is changing constantly. And I always feel a little bit apprehensive in putting things down on paper. But for a rare shift of pace, this talk is already written up. It was written here in Denver. And if anyone wants a hard copy of it, I'd be really happy to share it for further engagement. Lindsay, you can go to the next slide, and then I'll start us off. So in the latter part of 2021, I had the opportunity and the privilege to rediscover, to co-construct, and to experience on an embodied level a counter community of care. It's a community that I'm part of, that I sometimes disqualify myself from, that I hide away from, but essentially one that I always seem to return to for encounter, for restoration, for care, for community, and for rehumanization. The Gender and Religion program that I'm the head of at the School of Religion, Philosophy, and Classics, and the Ujamaa Center, and our knowledge production partner, Inclusive and Affirming Ministries, hosted the third queer think tank exploring the theme counter communities of care. This was the third in a series of queer developed and centered think tank spaces that brought together queer activists, clergy, scholars, and strategic allies working for LGBTI inclusion and liberation in faith settings. The first pioneering queer think tank was hosted at the Faculty of Stellenbosch, where I was based then in 2015, under the banner Talking Back. And the convening, the first one, aimed to push back against the dominant ways in which LGBTI people and lived realities were spoken about in South African faith communities. So often within faith settings, and maybe that resonates also in the US context, LGBTI lives are talked about as if it's an agenda item, as if it's a point of discussion. So LGBTI people are often constructed within faith communities as invisible, impossible, or on the outside of mainline faith communities, as if they do not exist and have not played important roles within faith communities as leaders, pastors, theologians, and change makers. This queer think tank in 2015 served as a unique catalyst moment to bring change makers from all over the faith community spectrum in South Africa together and to start exactly a pushback conversation. But it also allowed us to start networks for change making to continue beyond events. The second queer think tank was entitled Embodied Resistance and was hosted in 2017. And the convening offered a critical reflection space on the embodied nature of change making and the high individual and collective mental health and psychosocial cost involved in activism and diversity awareness raising. And what this think tank was sort of really good at is setting up intersectional conversation. So learning from activists and change makers thinking around race or class or gender within faith spaces. Although the third, so this one that I'm talking about now, although the third queer think tank was planned for 2019-2020, it couldn't take place until 2021 due to COVID-19 realities. And it was interesting how there was a bunch of things that happened online, but everyone involved in this specific convening was insistent on the fact that it had to be in person. The pertinent need for embodied encounter, care, and community was highly visible and often articulated during the course of the gathering. And although accompaniment and care for activists and change makers are often highlighted as key objectives or strategic focus areas for civil society and funding organizations. This convening allowed time for critical, collective, and stakeholder-centered reflections on the meaning and the expectation of what informs authentic accompaniment for those affected by homophobic exclusion, stigmatization, and violence. So one of the key themes that we explored as part of this convening was that of vulnerability. As part of our collective process of discernment, we engaged the notions of accompaniment. Participants were guided to reflect on their own contextual and collective experiences of vulnerability. And I was struck by a self-realization that I found echoed as one participant after another bravely shared their longings and desires for care, support, and accompaniment. I found articulated in the sharing that foundational to many understandings and constructions of care and accompaniment in the context of queer vulnerability is the imperative to being seen, acknowledged, included, and being considered part of something or belonging to something. In short, accompaniment applied a longing for recognition. The exclusion, stigmatization, and violence experienced by LGBTI people make it clear that it can't be said that LGBTI people are not seen in African communities, or that they somehow pass or slip below the radar. LGBTI people are seen. Our difference is written on our bodies, and our otherness leaves us vulnerable and open to being wounded. We see this well illustrated in the meaning of the name given to African LGBTI people when Izitabane, the slang word, derogatory slang word, is flung towards LGBTI people. So Izitabane is a term that gives derogatory expression to the othering, stigmatization, and exclusion experienced by LGBTI people in African faith context in general and in faith communities in particular. So some people might hear this word, especially if this word has been a word that's been used to exclude you. If you hear this word, it would have embodied a visceral response with you. And some might say, like, why would you choose to use this word? So just to say something about that, my choice is informed by the imperative of queer theory that insists on the disruptive reclaiming of what is used to exclude or violate. So similar to reclaiming the term queer. Izitabane, this is an insistence of making visible the lives and the lived realities of African LGBTI people who have always been part of the African landscape and is not somehow some Western imagination or import. Secondly, the choice to trouble or destabilize the derogatory also inspires and amplifies agency, creativity, and the possibility for connection and meaning-making as a counter to often exclusive representations of LGBTI people as vulnerable or victims of violence. The embodied otherness of LGBTI people is often a source of shame, not only for LGBTI people themselves, but also for the families, the communities, and the faith communities to which they belong. The queer otherness not only has implications for queer people, but also for their families and the communities that they are part of. Families are othered, made to feel shame, and as a result often want to distance themselves from that thing that makes them queer. This is not surprising if one considers the dominant and pervasive definitions of family that is dictated by heteropatriarchy, consisting of a mother and a father and 2.5 children. This definition of a nuclear family or a natural family, as propagated by the religious right and cemented in colonial and heteronormative discourse, not only excludes queer families or alternative families, but also misrecognizes the diversity of families as constituted in the African context. Research has shown that this nuclear understanding of family has never been the norm in the South African context, and less than 1/3 of South African families actually conform to a cisgendered heteronormative biological parent model that is held up as this constructed ideological norm. So over and against this type of seeing, what I'm arguing for is a different kind of seeing. The different way of seeing would imply a compassionate witnessing and a humanizing gaze of recognition. So recognition, to truly see and to be seen, I will argue in this contribution, implies the process of interrogation of power and positionality, empathy and imagination, weeping, mourning, and the commitment to community. I use the story of Joseph as we find it in Genesis 37, the latter part of the book of Genesis, chapter 37 to 50, as a reflective surface. And this is a term that I like using. It's this idea that a story becomes a mirror that is held up in front of us, and it allows us to mirror something of our own experience against the narrative. Lindsay, we can move to the next section, and I'm going to keep this short. So to understand these experiences of exclusion, structural exclusion, ideological exclusion of LGBTI people, I then go into what is the structural realities underlying this. And I do this because I think this is often overlooked. We engage the contextual, but we're not saying it's embedded within a systemic reality, and that system is pervasive. It's the water we swim in. It's something that we're not questioning. So I delve into econo-heteropatriarchy, so the idea that heteronormativity and patriarchy links to each other, but that it informs economic systems. So the cis, het, pet, cap abbreviation also links to that. And from that flows then, of course, biological essentialist understanding of sex, the pervasive binary classification of sex as polar opposite male and female, and then the power dynamic that comes into that. And also then how this informs ideas of what it means to be a man, and then fundamentally also what it means to be a family. The systemic ideology is pervasive and insidious and undermines and discredits all that is not conforming to this ideal. So one of the key mechanisms identified by Foucault, who's under discussion this week in our class, and others to protect or maintain the normative is through the normative gaze of surveillance. The normative gaze of surveillance that individuals are systemically keep in check, especially when it comes to embodiment, sex, and pleasure. The normative gaze of surveillance aims to keep the norm intact by undermining, discrediting, undoing, or violently annihilating or correcting all that is considered counter-normative. And in the South African context, corrective or curative homophobic hate crimes or conversion therapy within faith settings, medical settings, and also cultural settings have the same system to conform or return to as prescribed by heteronormativity and patriarchy. Okay, so this is the context. Thank you. That is exactly where we are at. Thank you, Lindsay. So what I'd like to share with you now is the Ujamaa Center that I'm part of. We are aware that faith communities contribute to the dominant understandings and ideas because of the fact that the biblical text is a patriarchal text. It's written by men for a community of men to uphold a community of men. It's not surprising that that text informs violence, and I have argued this in other places. But what we're trying to do here is to reclaim the biblical text within African faith communities as in a liberative practice. So how do we read the text in order as a reflective surface in order to allow not only African faith communities to grapple with issues of gender and sexuality, but also to enable LGBTI people in the African context, for whom the Bible, often the Bible is the enemy, right? It's something that you wouldn't consider engaging. How could the biblical text be used in a liberative way? So through this work, we aim to illustrate something of our fundamental ideological commitment to not talk about those who are vulnerable or susceptible to violence, but to work alongside organized communities and talk with those who experience these lived realities. It's a deliberative and a deconstructive process, as the Bible is often understood as something that belongs to faith leaders or to academic scholars. And foundationally, the story of Joseph in Genesis 37 and the contextual Bible study resources that we've developed from it has become an example of how African Izitabane has a way of taking back the word. We do this work in partnership with civil society actors and inclusive and affirming ministries and the Ujamaa Center, and the Gender and Religion Program. We all work together and we come up with these resources, and then we test them, and then it comes back and we reflect on it. So it's never really finished. But the example that I share with you has gone through numerous rounds of sort of rolling it out. I'd like to share this as a resource with you. It is open access, it's available, you can use it, there's user guides to it. And the point of it fundamentally is to spark conversation. We are making trouble in order to enable conversation. So let me share the contextual Bible study with you. I'm doing that in 3 parts. So the first set of questions speak to the way in which Joseph is set apart in the story. The second part looks at the punitive response by the family, and then the final part of the contribution tries to think about how this could be an impulse for hope. Okay, so let me firstly, Lindsay, I'm going to talk through it, and then I'm going to ask you to or maybe share the questions while I talk through it, so then people can read. Okay, so perfectly, being set apart. So the first set of questions thinks about the way in which Joseph is set apart in the narrative. The garment, so you'll see Joseph is clearly set apart in the story, what contributes to his otherness. And what's interesting is he's set apart in the story because he's a dreamer, and because of that coat of many colors that Jacob gifts him with in a very complex parental strategy. And then in that second question, we draw a little bit on biblical scholarship. So that garment, which has a clear function of identity marker, is described by the same word in an older biblical text, the story that we find in 2 Samuel 13, the rape of Tamar. And it is described there as a dress fit for a princess. So Jacob gives Joseph a dress fit for a princess. And this opens up an array of queer interpretive possibilities, as you can just think. Jacob gives Joseph with a princess dress, and in the process, the outsider becomes colorfully othered. Joseph is, however, not only set apart due to his dress, but also due to his dreams. And the wearing of the robe and the sharing of the dreams invokes an array of negative emotions from the extended family. And you'll see, if you read the text, numerous times the word hate. Hate is a very strong emotion that is evoked by his difference. And when Izitabane and queer people read this story, it resonates, right? Being different, being a little bit more colorful, being outside of what is considered norm. So the questions allow for the importance also of thinking of clothing as an expression of identity and how this others us and makes us different. Then a second set of questions has been really productive for us because it opens up the possibility to think more distinctively about the punitive reactions it brings out from the brothers. So Lindsay, you can move to the next set of questions. The text highlights the regime of control that is constructed by the implementation of the normative gaze. The brothers, and the text is incredible if you read that story. They see him coming from afar. He's this thing that is standing out and that is being extra and that is drawing attention, and everyone is like, can you just calm down? So they see him coming from afar, and as they see him, they plot with each other and they say, this is not cool. It's outside of the expected masculine norm. And the violent progression of the plot is painful to witness as they see him, hate him, plot to do harm, commit the crime, very reminiscent of homophobic hate crime or curative rape, and in trying to keep the norm intact. And then they sit down and have a meal as if nothing has happened. And I mean, if you read that, it's absolutely like it blows you away if you really listen to what happens in that story. So there you see the questions that we ask. And then we also ask the sneaky little divisive question by asking Jacob's intent when he sends Joseph to his brothers, sort of making a little bit of trouble thinking about, did Jacob know what was going to happen here? And is he part of this man-making activity that happens in the story? The question, of course, also opens up space to reflect on the memory of Jacob's own fluid gender expression and how this might inform his relationship to Joseph and the events that transpire in the narrative. So they, what also makes it really amazing is that, and we know this, that violence often happens within the intimate family setting. And this text has allowed us to open up conversations, contextual conversations about that. But by saying this, I also want to say that we've become aware in the rollout of this contextual Bible study. So it starts off with a dramatization of it. So we create a little play with everyone that's there, and we act it out because that just lifts the text out of paper. We've just realized that it has incredible possibility also for triggering and re-traumatization, and the importance of creating space for people to debrief and to hold that space has become really important. The final set of questions, and I think you can push to those. It serves as a natural point of connection to the final part of this reflection that I'd like to share with you today, as we think about how does this text also allows us to think about hope. And none of these, I mean, that question that's bold there. So how does Joseph's experiences of trauma and vulnerability grow into a tale of redemption for all the sons of Israel? What is the resources of hope of this story? That's also not an innocent question, right? Because Joseph, yes, escapes the drama of his family, but then he becomes an imperial overlord. He becomes someone who gains from people's vulnerability within the empire of Egypt. So, and he exploits the vulnerable by enslaving them fundamentally on the back of a climate crisis. So I think we've often said, you know, yes, there's impulses of hope here, but it's also not straightforward or clear cut. Okay, then the final part of the reflection. As I've said, the final sequence of questions in the original Genesis 37 contextual Bible study, as developed and implemented by the Ujamaa Center and our civil society partners, hints at impulses of hope and the possibility for change. The process of healing, restoration, and restitution, how it should look like in the context of ongoing violence and discriminations against LGBTI people in the African context. It has offered us a starting point to reflect on questions such as, how do we as a community come back or recover from such staggering practices of misrecognition and dehumanization and violence? So what we've done is we've used these last questions and sort of thinking that's developed around it to move into the latter part of the Joseph narrative. In the latter part of the Joseph story, we find a winding, complex narrative of recognition, restoration, and healing within the confines of family context against the background of climate migration and international aid. It is clear from the narrative that healing in this context is not a linear process. There is no end game, and that it's never complete or finalized. From the unfolding of the Joseph narrative, it is clear that not only the reality of embodied experiences of violence or sexual or gender-based violence is fuzzy, messy, and icky, as Ryan Grable argues, but also that the process of deep healing is complicated. So Carly Vogt from Emory did thought-provoking work on the Joseph narrative in the context of counseling and thinking about family violence. And I find this process of recognition and reconciliation depicted in the narrative really a dynamic reflective surface to enable conversations about healing and accompaniment. After all the misrecognition and violence depicted in the narrative, there is an imperative for recognition in the narrative's unfolding. This recognition as a conceptual notion and the animating force that it holds potential in the context of misrecognition and identity erasure. But I found the work of Kelly Oliver on recognition especially helpful and thought-provoking, as she articulates some strong points that I found resonance with in the Joseph narrative. So Oliver highlights the power dynamic and the complexity inherent to the imperative of recognition when arguing that the one who needs recognition because of misrecognition or erasure somehow remains suspended and dependent on recognition from the one who does not recognize. So you remain suspended in this position of now you're waiting to be recognized. So though the notion of recognition, oppressed people remain beholden on their oppressor for recognition. And in this process, a toxic power dynamic is kept in place. Secondly, she critiques the notion that recognition is set up as an event, a goal, something that happens once off, and then we're done with it, and that moment miraculously makes possible mutual recognition. And she rather speaks of, so she's very critical actually of the notion of recognition, and she speaks of a process-centered nature of seeing and recognition, and she argues for the idea of witnessing. So the latter part of the Joseph narrative holds a long and evoking tale of recognition and misrecognition, of hiding one's true identity and coming out, showing yourself your true, and admitting your wrongdoing, reframing, and forgiveness. And it speaks to the power dynamic of recognition and misrecognition. So one of the key dimensions within the text that enables us to reflect on the power dynamics involved in the process of recognition is the disturbance in the one-directional power flow of the narrative. So although Joseph longs for recognition from his family that misrecognizes him, he stays uniquely vulnerable and wounded because of this misrecognition. And you see him in the narrative crying constantly, going away from them and crying and feeling very, very sad because they still misrecognize him. The overall power dynamic of the story changes because he was one at the mercy of his brothers, is now the one who comes to their mercy. The narrative speaks of a play of recognition and misrecognition as Joseph queerly hides and reveals himself in a long and windy performance of showing himself and letting himself be known to those who wounded him so deeply in misrecognition and erasure. So when engaging and thinking about the drama of recognition in the Joseph narrative as a contemporary reflective surface, to my mind, it opens up space to trouble or to think about a number of dimensions of contemporary struggles for recognition and the validation of human dignity. And I share 3 or 4 points. Firstly, it creates a space for us to reflect about the power dynamics of recognition as highlighted by Oliver. It allows contemporary marginalized communities to ask questions about who sees, who determines the outcome of the seeing, and it allows space for reflection on the time frame for justice. So how long do we remain suspended in this place of misrecognition while we hang on to be seen? Or phrased differently, how long do we remain at the table when respect is no longer served? Secondly, Joseph's story of revealing his true identity to those who caused him harm, or rather the process of coming out to his family, creates a contemporary space for LGBTI people to think about the process of coming out. Joseph's careful navigation of this process of revealing his identity also helps us to reflect on the very real threats of shame, harm, and violence that are so closely related to the process of self-actualization. And then I share some results. I recently had the wonderful opportunity to think with queer clergy in the Dutch Reformed Church about the process of coming out, and 20 interviews. And when asked contemporary clergy about coming out, a couple of things emerged. They said, like, firstly, for many of them, the background of the process of coming out, there still exists this very real threat of public humiliation. So a lot of people still struggle to navigate this because of that threat. Mostly for almost all of the people I interviewed, it remains an ongoing process, and it's contextual, right? You keep on coming out in different sections. But so many of these people spoke about the joy and liberation that comes from integrating different parts of your identity in public spaces. Thirdly, the Joseph narrative helps us to trouble the event-constructed once-off nature of recognition. When we see misrecognition, even after all the recognition. So in the story, it's really interesting that even after they know it's Joseph and they're so stoked that he saved them and they're so excited about it all, then they still caucus amongst each other and they're like, oh, but maybe he's going to change his mind and hate us again. So this play of, yes, we see you and we trust you, but oh, we're also struggling to integrate all these things. Fourthly, the narrative places seeing and being seen in a larger systemic power reality. So although much of the Joseph narrative cycle in Genesis is concentrated on the misrecognition of Joseph and the drama of recognition as the brothers found their way back to Joseph in the unfolding of the plot, it is stated at the beginning of the Exodus narrative that there was a new Pharaoh in Egypt and they did not know of Joseph. So this whole drama is situated also in much bigger narrative frames and power frames. Finally, in conversation with his brother, Joseph gives a glimpse of how he has learned to cope with the trauma that's inflicted on him. So when he starts explaining his reality to him, he evokes God. And although God is delightfully absent from the narrative unfolding, he says to his brothers that it's not them who inflicted this trauma on him, but that it was God who allowed all these things to happen to him so that there could be redemption for all. Now, I guess like Joseph, we all do what we can to make sense of the violence and the trauma that we've experienced. I think the explanation that Joseph constructs in the process of reframing as he deals with the impact of this trauma is problematic and a quick fix to a highly problematic family dynamic and the violence that it enables. This dimension of the narrative helps us to critically engage with the danger of the toxic theologies that we employ and hold others hostage to as we navigate trauma. Theologies where we sanctify suffering, or where we make it impossible for vulnerable people to live life-denying relationships. And I think the tail end of the Joseph narrative really helps us to interrogate those sort of narratives. So a final word in conclusion. We are indeed all family until we are not. The wounds of misrecognition can be fatal. Recognition, if constructed as a once-off event that is suspended by and upholds toxic power dynamic, is not enough. Maybe as our pain is messy and complicated, our healing implies a process rather than an event. So maybe beyond recognition, there is a need for a dynamic relationship of accompaniment, where we see and where we are being seen, where we reflect on the power dynamics that allow some to be seen and others to be erased, where we are called out of hiding, and where we could learn to do better, where we can sit with the discomfort of the incompleteness and the unfolding of the process of becoming. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlene. Yes, I see people clapping hands, clapping hands. Thank you so much. I think, and I can turn this back over to Charlene, that we discussed, I'm looking at the 51 boxes in front of me, giving you all the opportunity to ask Charlene questions. And yeah, to just turn it over to the audience. So I don't know the most Zoom effective way of doing that, whether that means raising hands and all. I've never had a class of 50 people or an audience of 50 people before. So if you can figure out the function on your screen of raising your hand, if you have a question, I would be happy to call on you. If you can't and you just want to unmute and go for it, we can sort of have some bedlam and do it that style too. So at the very least though, Charlene, thank you. I'm having literally thinking I might have to go read my Bible for the first time in a really long time. And maybe have a little bit different sort of reading of what the story of Joseph. So okay, you all, thanks again. If folks want to again unmute or wave at me, let's turn it over to you all. Anyone?
Luke.
Thanks for the fabulous talk, Charlene. And it's really moving to see the space that you're working in, especially given the importance of obviously the faith communities to people's identities. When I was in Pietermaritzburg and your students were giving presentations, they're searching out their own journeys, often queer journeys, through through different but yet similar theological frameworks. And my question really has to do with, you mentioned this in passing, but how much of an impact do you see this having individually on the people who are participating and working with, let's say, the story of Joseph? And I always think Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat, and I've forgotten who does that. That's something pop, isn't it? Yes.
It's Andrew Lloyd Webber on Broadway.
So, but in that story and in the work that you do, because it's so important, and I was just curious to hear a little bit more about the personal reactions that you get in their own journeys.
Yeah, I mean, Luke, that's a great question. And I think maybe just taking one step back, I think so what happens with the Ujamaa Center is we get invited, right, to come and speak, usually when faith leaders has come to a point where they said, like, I have the Bible in this hand and I know what it's supposedly telling me, but I have contextual realities that's really confronting and complicated, and I don't know how to navigate it. So we usually walk into siloed, very highly contested, complicated spaces and especially around LGBTI lived realities. So I think I said this in the class as well. You know, there's a bunch of social justice issues where the battle is moving in a positive direction, right? So no one in South Africa would say, no, we shouldn't talk about gender and gender-based violence. If the jury is out that gender-based violence is something that we collectively need to engage. But in African faith communities, everyone is not convinced that LGBTI people are people. So that is the setting in which we usually walk in, and what we start with usually is asking a question, okay, so what does the Bible say about LGBTI people? What does it say? And then, of course, the answer is always the 6 shooter texts, you know, those like 5 or 6 verses, and the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And we've developed a really great Bible study around the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, but like I have just found myself moving to a space where that embattled ground is not productive. So we're searching for other alternative faith resources to have these engagements. And usually the response of people when they actually then read this biblical text is very similar to what Lindsay has said. Oh my goodness, maybe I should actually read the text. So I recently wrote a little article, because what happens, for instance, around the Genesis 19 narrative is that when you ask people, okay, so what does the Bible say about LGBTI? Then God is against it, Sodom and Gomorrah, you're all going to hell. And then it's like, have you actually read that story? And have you read the inner textual interpretation of that story? Because if you do, there is no way that you can come to that conclusion. It's not what that text is about. So I think when you actually read the text with people are like, wow, you know, there's actually possibilities for liberation here, and maybe I shouldn't just write that off and say, you know, it's not productive, I can't use it. And by that, I'm not saying that it's not a highly problematic text, and that if you wanted to annihilate people, you can definitely find a verse to do it. But I think we've become so entrenched in the one directional traffic around what the Bible says around things, that when there's an alternative, people are like inspired, I think, and energized by the possibility of reading it in a community. Sorry, that was a very long rant to a short question, and classic my style.
That was fabulous answer. Thank you.
Fantastic. And I see other hands. So I'm going to say, Christy, if you want to go next. And then I see a Jamie out there as well. So we'll start with Christy.
Thank you. Hi. I apologize for not having my camera on. I have a child at home as well, so I'm dealing with that. But thank you so much for this presentation. I am also working on families currently, a little bit later than your text, so New Testament and early Christianity, but thinking through some options for queer families that are doing some very similar work. So was really thrilled to hear your presentation today. And my question sort of aligns with your previous answer, but I wanted to know if you had read any other biblical texts in this contextual Bible study besides the Joseph story and Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah. Christy, thank you very much for that. I'm always so happy if someone reads the other side of the Bible. Yes. I love Old Testament text, and I've just always been like drawn into the narratives. So since I've been appointed at the Ujamaa Center, so 2017, we deliberately decided to start developing resources in this area. So we've done quite a bit of work around Genesis 1 and 2 because of how foundational those texts are often when arguing for binary gender constructions and whatever. And also that possibility of the trans possibilities for reading the multiplicity of God in those texts, really interesting. Then Genesis 19, and we've opened the frame to Genesis 18, Genesis 37. So Gerald West and I wrote an article called The Queer Beginning of the Bible, because we found ourselves stuck in Genesis a lot. And then we've now, so we're in the process of developing a number of things. The thing that we're now focusing on is actually in the New Testament, thinking about the Ethiopian eunuch and his engagement around the reading of the scriptures as a possibility for trans folk to engage in the text. But Christy, I'm saying these examples, and they're all available online on our website, open access, use them, abuse them. We're always open to more text to make trouble with. So if you've got a good example, you think a story could lean itself into queerness. I've now recently done quite a bit of work on the book of Jonah, in the context of anger and disillusionment and whatever, mostly because of my own situatedness in terms of faith communities. So that raw despondence. So here's a character that's despondent. How do we engage that? So we're shopping all over the show, and we're open. So if anyone has good ideas, please, please suggest it. We're working with someone around the Reclaiming Jonathan, really interesting, a Swedish scholar who's now done incredible work around Jonathan. So we're trying to develop that into a CBS as well.
Thank you so much. I am really eager to hear to read the Ethiopian eunuch one, especially.
Cool.
So I'm excited to see where some of this future work will go as well.
We just met this morning to discover the layout of the presentation, and we're going to present it at the global virtual meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature. I'll send you a link.
Oh, perfect.
When we present it. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Christy. Jamie, if you would like to unmute and ask your question, go for it.
Hi. So something I have always been especially interested in with biblical text is alternate translations of the original text instead of like the English version. I wanted to know how much you've delved into that and like your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Jamie. That's a brilliant question. You know, translation is our first act of interpretation and what happens there. So maybe one example in the Ethiopian eunuch text, the isiZulu word, so the language that's predominantly spoken in the area that I come from, opens up really interesting interpretive possibilities for thinking about the identity of the Ethiopian eunuch. And what we've done is we've incorporated a question. So if we were to read that text in isiZulu or isiXhosa, we would ask the question, okay, so read this text in various translations. What is the word used here and what is the meaning of that? A second example is we've been working with David Toombs. He's from New Zealand scholar, and he's done like a whole body of work around the stripping of Jesus. And he explores the notion of stripping and the context in which that happens as an expression of gender-based violence. And we've developed a Bible study around the Matthew text of the crucifixion. And if you read that text in the original isiZulu, the word used for stripping that people usually brush over, right? It's Jesus was stripped in this cohort of 500 men, and then Jesus was stripped here, whatever. You read through that thing and you sort of brush over it. But if you think about the word that is used there, it has very violent and shaming connotations. And that has become an incredible entry point to talk about violence committed against men by other men in a sexual way for shame. Now that Bible study, like if talking about LGBTI issues is a challenge, talking about Jesus in the context of gender-based violence and men raping men I am telling you, it is highly contested, highly complex, very dynamic, and sometimes even problematic to manage that space, because people are like, you are touching me, oh my Jesus, this is sacrilege. And yet that is sort of the things that text evokes, right? So that's been just two examples that's now come up for me when, and then of course in the Joseph narrative, the princess dress. So that possibilities for interpretations. Now, not called the princess dress in the original Hebrew, but just that ideas that's brought up that allows for a diversity of possible interpretation. But thank you, that's a great question.
Thanks, Jamie. And y'all, I'm scrolling and I don't see other hands up. Would anybody like to unmute or ask a question before? Hi, Nadine, go for it.
Hi, I'm really not an expert on like any sort of religious studies, and I think it's really interesting to hear this perspective. But like as a personal atheist, I'm curious how important like a belief in like theology and God is necessary for accepting and understanding this reading of the text. So like, do you feel like that's an important aspect of kind of like understanding this and like accepting this, or does it not really matter your attachment or belief in God? And thank you so much also for being here. Sorry.
Great, that's a fantastic question, and I think it speaks back to the contextual. So my colleague at the Ujamaa Center, Gerald West, he makes this point that like a lot of scholars, and I might include myself amongst that, you know, it's not like I'm feeling super invested in the biblical text, but I work in a context where people are very committed to reading the Bible, engaging the Bible, making sense and meaning from the Bible. So he argues that the Bible is already present in the African context where these issues are engaged. So we can say, well, do we need to believe or do we need to read the Bible as individuals? But I think what we've found as a center is that, and it's unique to faith communities, especially like in South Africa, 86% of people say that they're believers. They go to church, they have a practice. So it's just this community of people that engage, and they all confess that the biblical text is super important to them. So in a classic queer method, it's like, okay, if you say the Bible is so important to you, let's read it. And then, so we're actually making trouble, to be honest. It's not like me or like everyone around me is like hardcore believers and very committed to keeping the community of faith intact. I mean, of course, some of my students are. Some of my colleagues are deeply committed to faith communities. For me, I'm a little bit more instrumental when I think around faith communities. I think it's a means to an end. It's a captive audience. It's people that, it's a movable middle that you can actually engage. And you're using the one thing that they say is really important to them. You know, and so like in Luke's class discussion also, like we spoke a lot about how conversations around identity and identity formation and whatever has sometimes come to a little bit of a dead end, you know, because people are just like, this is what I believe and that's the end of it. And if there's no possibility for conversation or encounter of the other, how do we ever change our minds? And this practice, I think, allows us to suspend judgment for a minute, because we're not talking about our own lives. I'm not talking about my queerness. I'm talking about Jacob and Joseph and all their dramas in their family. It's like talking about a soap, you know, it's great. But then it allows me to bring that back to my context, so to say. And this is something that faith communities do in anyway. They read the Bible. Like, I don't think the way in which faith communities deal with the Bible on a Sunday morning, where one dude gets to say for an hour what it means, I don't think that's productive in any possible way. But I think this practice allows for just alternative modes to engage the biblical text and faith in a productive way. And fun. It's fun, right? To ask these questions and to see a little bit how things are, how the wheels are turning in people's heads, when they think about it. No, it's creative.
Oh, I love that question. I love that answer. So thank you, Charlene. Is there anybody else? Again, I'm like scrolling, looking for hands.
Oh, Sandra, hi.
Sandy, hi, go for it.
Hi, thank you. Hi, Charlene. I believe we're on Zoom over the summer, and I was so hoping to see you today in person, but oh well. So I'm, for those of you who don't know me, I am chairing the Department of Religious Studies here at DU now. And I want to say, first of all, that I loved what I heard from you. Thank you so much. It's intersecting with a doctoral student's dissertation, though, by the way, she's not touching the Bible in her dissertation, but this whole question of how we hear, how we recognize. And her question has a lot to do with what does it do to the person who's listening to really listen? So I'm thinking a little bit in the context of Joseph and his brothers, in what way are they on the line when they begin to recognize him? What is it doing to them? But all this rhapsodizing, I could do it forever. What I want to say more directly is that this is a lot of what we do in religious studies, folks. It's not all the Bible. We have people teaching in Buddhism and Hinduism, and my own field is religion and psych, etc. But I just want to say that, yes, we do these things. So no, you don't have to be a believer. But I think as we look at stories from across history and around the world and teachings and so forth, these questions of how do we receive them? Really, how do we receive them? What shall we make of them? Those are very live questions for us, and ones that we love for our major in helping with the liberal arts education. Because I would say that those questions are there potentially with anything you read.
Yeah.
And we just sort of sometimes do it for fun and spontaneously. But then if we listen to somebody like Charlene, we begin to see, oh, we can do it even better, So it's one thing to watch a lot of or read a lot of Harry Potter and decide if you're Gryffindor or some other house, right? But it becomes even richer and more exciting when you have all these different tools to bring to bear on it. So again, thank you. And thank you, Lindsay, for setting this up for us. This is just wonderful.
Well, you're welcome. I want to give a shout out to Kate, our amazing assistant, who really set it up and who really set up, was going to set up 55 chairs for all of y'all in person. And then she got 8 a.m. Zoom texts about, hey, we got to go online. So Kate, thank you so much for your flexibility. Charlene, thank you for being here. You all, I don't see other questions out there. If I'm missing someone, please feel free to unmute and cut me off. I'd love to give you all space. Charlene, thank you again. I can't tell you personally how much I'm rethinking just childhood and trying to maybe through a different lens of thinking about my own background, but then also your answer really sort of, I think for me, says, why does this matter even if you're not a believer? Well, we live in a world with political power, and in different states these beliefs often get codified and legislated, and I don't need to tell the audience out there how important that is, but my intro students, I think we will see many lines of starting entry points on conversation. So to all of you out there, thank you for coming. I know I made you, but boy, what a treat for you. And Charlene, thank you again. So if anybody has questions for Charlene, please contact me. I can send you her contact info. You can see the email announcement. She mentioned several open access sources. If anybody wants to start a queer Bible study, how cool would that be? maybe. So anyway, it sounds like it's, yeah, there's lots of cool possibilities. And more importantly, I should say equally as importantly, if anybody wants to learn more about global scholars, about these amazing partnerships, not just with GWST, but with DU in general, I'm happy to point you in the right direction of folks. Luke, thank you for making this happen and the connection with Charlene, and then enabling us all to share and learn from it. So thank you all. Stay warm. Someone said, Dr. Fights, can you publish this hard copy in our, oh yeah, I love it. Students want more already. So yes, class,
I'll send it to you.
will. Awesome. Thanks, Charlene. Okay, you all. Thank you again. Everybody stay warm out there, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlene.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
guys. Thank you so much, Kate.
Thanks, Kate.